Hello everyone, thank you for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're going to be going over the new features for Enterprise Pdm, Workgroup Pdm, and Toolbox. And these are the new features for 2012. So I don't have a long PowerPoint, I'd like to just jump into it. Here's a list of some of the new features for Enterprise Pdm, again, for year 2012. Now I'm not going to read through each one of them, some are bigger than others, but I'd like to just jump into the software and show you some of these additions. So without further ado, let's get into this. I'm going to go ahead and call up my local view. Okay, so go to my local view here. One of the first things I want to point out is the ability to customize a lot of the interface for Enterprise Pdm local view. So if I right click the toolbar here, you'll see this option for customize menus. If I select that, you'll see I have an option to choose what I want to see in my right click, for instance. Okay, so you see here background right click, and this is the options, these are the choices I have when I do a background right click. Now I can also have file right click, folder right click, and then the bar menu options. Now you'll see here the bar menu it's referring to is this toolbar here, actions, modify, display, and tools. So I'm going to choose file right click, and one thing I've always wanted to see is get version in the right click menu. Okay, it's not there by default, but now in 2012 you can add it. So if I select get version on the left hand side, I can add it with this plus symbol to my tool set here and then drag it up in the interface where I'd like to see it. Okay, so maybe here, just above get latest. And now all I have to do is hit apply, and when I right click I now have the option to get version. Okay, so again, I can customize the interface, not only the right-click methods, but also what shows up in the action, modify, display, and tools toolbar in my local view. Some other things I can do is I can reset back to default. So if I've changed it or if I'm adopting some other computer and they have it set a different way, I can reset this setting back to default. Another thing that's nice, and maybe from more an administrator's point of view, is you can copy settings from an existing user. Okay, so I can copy the file right-click settings from admin if I chose to. So I don't have to set it up individually on individual users. I can set it up for one user and then copy the settings to a bunch of different users. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of that. That's customizing the interface. The next thing I want to point out, and you may not have caught it, is notice it's showing my full name, Cody Armstrong. But if I view the login credentials, you'll see I'm actually logged in as username C Armstrong. That's because of a new option in the Explorer settings that says to show full usernames. This option allows me to show the full username even though it doesn't necessarily represent their actual login name. Okay, so no longer do I have to decrypt what Esparza is or any of their names. It says the full username under the checked out by. Okay, so no longer is that up for guess who that is. It's pretty obvious. Okay, so the next couple changes I'd like to get into are in the interface itself, namely things like browse to. Okay, the browse to function, for instance, let's look at bill of materials here. Let's look at my local view. When I was viewing, for instance, let's go to the where used, or actually contained, excuse me. When I was viewing this, and I was going through this assembly, and I'm looking at all the parts for the assembly, there's no easy way for me to go to the folder where this file was located, for instance. I could browse, I could, note it here, found in this path, and go over here and browse to it. But there's no simple way for me to just jump to that folder. In the 2012 version, you can now right-click Browse To. This will browse to that folder in Windows Explorer, just above you. So no longer do you have to manually browse to that or take note of the folder and then browse to it and find it yourself. You can right-click Browse To. It'll take you to that folder, that file in the correct folder. Okay, again, that's in the contains, also in the where used. Okay. BOMs. One of the big changes for BOMs this year is the ability to export an indented CSV BOM. When I do a save as, and I set my save as type to CSV file, you'll now have an option. Would you like to create a level column? And the main reason you'd want a level column in your CSV file is a way of setting the hierarchy of your data, allowing it to have a structure that resembles something that you might use in SOLIDWORKS. And that data structure is important to categorizing it. So one more column in there definitely helps as far as establishing the order in which your assembly is laid out. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say no to that. Now the next thing I like to bring up is within the search window. Tool has been overhauled for the 2012 version, and what I mean by that is the way it works has changed just a bit. It looks very similar, but one of the big things you'll notice is in the past when you launched search, it would launch a whole separate window, which means by the end of the day you'd go to engineers' computers and they'd have 12 of these search windows up because they just didn't close them out. What's nice about the integration with the search tool in the 2012 version is when I hit search now, it allows me to search right inside of the dialog box. Okay, so no longer does it launch a separate window that I then have to go through and close out of after I'm done. It's right there integrated into the, in my case, Windows Explorer dialog. Okay, so for instance, I'll do a description search by ARM. I hit search. It finds all the documents with that in the name. Okay, now the question ultimately comes up, well, how do I get back to my local view now that you've searched? And that's the close search. So the same button that you use to launch the search, you use to close the search. Now the biggest thing about this, and the thing I think is most neat, is it's now integrated in anything that uses a file open, a Windows file open. So when I go file open, I can search right from my local view using this search. So I hit open search, I'll do a search for ARM, there's my document. I want to open it from there, I can open it from there. Okay. So again, I'm integrating the search tools for Enterprise Pdm into any application that uses file open or the standard Windows file open. So to show that one more time, I'm going to launch Word. Just Microsoft Word. Again, no CAD application. This has nothing to do with Enterprise specifically, but what's nice about it is, again, file open. If I look inside my vault, I can now search from the file open dialog. Okay, so again, any application that uses the standard Windows file open, you can now search from right inside the open dialog. So it's an easy way of finding your document and then opening it right from the open dialog. Okay. So moving on, one of the last things I want to point out, if I call up my local view again here, are these options, let's highlight an assembly, for the active configuration. I can actively change version as well as the active configuration, and there's an option for show or hide configurations. So now I have these hotkeys. No longer do I have to specify configurations or versions separately. I have these hotkeys at the top where I can quickly choose between them. Okay, same thing goes for the Where Used tab. I can specify versions or active configurations, and I have these nice buttons here to quickly go back and forth between them. Okay, again, in the past that was a little more clunky interface to switch between versions or to say I don't want to specify configurations. So that's pretty much it as far as the enhancements to Enterprise Pdm. There are some enhancements that are hard to quantify, namely some enhancements with regards to performance. There's been some significant enhancements to the performance of large assemblies, namely large assemblies that have lots and lots of parent-child relationships. It would take a long time to query that information in the past. It's gotten significantly better about opening and saving, checking in large assemblies. Again, that's just something that, again, it's not all that easy to quantify or to show, but it's definitely there. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the CAD editor. The PDM CAD editor license, the one I've been using here, now allows what we call web client. In the past, those were two separate licenses. You had a web client and you had a CAD editor. Now they're included. So when you have a CAD editor license, it now includes a web client. You can now access that vault from the web, assuming you have a web server set up for your vault. Okay, so no longer does that require a special license. So moving on, I'm going to get out of this. We'll get back into my PowerPoint here. Some of the features for Workgroup Pdm. It's not a huge overhaul for Workgroup Pdm this year. There's two primarily big features I think are worth mentioning, and that is the rebuild metadata option. I'm going to explain that in a second, and support for Vista and Windows 7, which I think is definitely a good advantage. In the past, you couldn't do a lot of things without XP if you're using Workgroup Pdm, and now they've added some needed functionality for Workgroup Pdm in Vista and Windows 7. So let's jump into it. First one, rebuild options. I'm going to go ahead and launch my Vault admin tool, log in. And if you've used this a lot, you're probably used to the rebuild Vault tool. What it does is it rebuilds the Vault, so if you're having sluggish speed, if you're having issues with long check-in times, long check-out times, I would definitely suggest rebuilding your Vault. One of the options now is to rebuild the metadata. So you'll see if I hit rebuild Vault here, I have these new options that I can specify what exactly in the Vault do you want it to rebuild. Now if I check all of these, it'll rebuild the metadata as well as the latest folders, the log files, so on. Okay, so again, this is a little more thorough about its rebuilding so that all those properties and file references are intact when it rebuilds. Okay, so that's the whole idea behind the rebuild option. It just refreshes the Vault, forces it to rebuild all that information and remain current. And again, now it includes the option to rebuild the metadata. The last one for Workgroup Pdm, I'm going to go ahead and hit OK to this. Okay, is the integration with or support for Vista and Windows 7. And what I mean by that, let me make sure I have Workgroup Pdm on. I do. Is when I go File, Open, I now have this option to browse Vault. Okay, when I select Browse Vault, it's very similar to XP. I can now browse and open documents from my Workgroup Pdm Vault right here. Okay, so again, Browse Vault from the Open dialog opens up another interface where I can select files from my Vault and open them. Okay, again, really just support for Windows Vista and Windows 7. You're not forced to use the task pane like you were in previous versions or SOLIDWORKS Explorer. You can now use the File Open dialog, and it's integrated into the latest versions of the Windows operating systems. Okay, so those are the primary enhancements for Workgroup Pdm. The last thing I'd like to get into is Toolbox. And Toolbox has actually been overhauled quite a bit. And, it doesn't look like it from my list there, but the way it changes has fundamentally changed quite a bit. And in the past, if you use Toolbox, you know that it's very dependent on a database file. It's a database file is stored with all the files, the Toolbox files themselves, but it's always very dependent on that file. So if that file got moved, it got changed, it created a lot of issues with Toolbox. I will say that the latest version is much less dependent on that toolbox, on that database file. A lot of the properties that were stored in the database file, like the part number, like the description, so on, are now stored with the document. And what that means is I can change them. Okay, it doesn't have quite the same constraints that it did in previous versions of Toolbox. So not only can I change things like part name, like description, but I can do copies and pastes and add new folders to the existing standards. And that was always one of the rule of thumbs is in the past you couldn't change much to the existing standards. You always had to go in and create a new one and then customize that one. In the latest version of the Toolbox, you have a lot more flexibility to what you can and can't do in the Toolbox. So what I'd like to do is show an example of some of this new functionality. I'm going to go ahead and jump out of this and into Toolbox settings. And the same thing you get when you go to Toolbox Configure. Brings up your Toolbox settings, allows me to customize just about everything in the Toolbox. And this is where we get into some of the definite enhancements to the Toolbox functionality. So if I go into, for instance, customize my hardware, one of the first things that I noticed is when I right click, I now have cut, copy, and delete options to the standard Toolbox databases. So if I wanted to, I could create my own folder, okay, call it custom, and start adding custom things to it. So let's say, I have a bearing I always use. I could right click, copy that, and paste it into my own custom standard set of Toolbox components. Okay, I can also do things like add a file. Again, all functionality I couldn't do, or at least alter in the standard database in older versions. Okay, one of the other things I can do is I can edit things like file names. So if I go into one of these ball bearings, for instance, these names are now editable fields. So if I want to show the McMaster car part number for my description as opposed to what is listed here, I can change this. Okay, and it will write that to record. Okay, I can also change things like the file name. Okay, so again, it allows me a little more flexibility in what I can and can't do, especially with a standard database. The ability to cut, copy, and paste of individual files, of whole standards, gives you a lot more functionality with the existing database. Again, in the past, what you had to do is go through and create your own database. Then you could do a lot of the things you could do here. Not all of them, but you could tweak a lot of the settings. But now you can change a lot of the settings of just the standard out-of-the-box toolbox. Okay, so that is pretty much it for my webcast. I want to thank you for joining.